being heard. So could you just type in the word clear if I'm being heard? I think I might have left myself on mute there for a period of time. So just wait to see whether people can hear me. Yep, good. Thanks, Terry. Righto. Thanks, Joanne. Thanks, William. Right. Thanks, John. Okay, good. I'm coming across loud and clear, which is always good to know. All right. So before we get underway, here are the 6 units that we've covered, and I just sort of do a quick recap. And the reason I want to do a recap here is that this is our last session, and as such, let's just go through those. So we started off with Unit 1, which was actually, we swapped Unit 1 and 2 around, so we actually did strategically managing performance, which is number 2 on your list there. So we're basically looking at the need to look at performance from a strategic point of view. And then in Unit 2, I got you to complete the influencing capabilities profile online, and you would have got some results back from there, and it would have really helped you, hopefully, to improve your influencing capability. So to apply that to people that perhaps don't think like you, and I hope you've had a bit of fun with that. In Unit 3, we looked at creating that thinking space, and I did suggest to you that leaders, particularly at your level, are really in the business of thinking, and you have to create that time because people often have huge demands on your time, and if you don't create that thinking time, then it just doesn't magically appear. So we did look at some issues around managing time and creating thinking space. In Unit 4, we looked at options for organisational restructuring, and I wanted to just challenge you to think a little bit about local government and how we have pretty much had the same standard organising structure around hierarchy for many, many years. And I think it's about time that people like you and me start challenging the status quo and consider some different ways that we might look at restructuring. In Unit 5, which is the one that we did 2 weeks ago, we looked at conflict management and negotiation, and I shared with you 5 conflict resolution and negotiation styles. And we completed a diagnostic which would give you an indication of what your preferred conflict and negotiation style is. And you might recall there were 5. There was avoiding, there was competing, there was compromising, there was collaboration, and there was accommodating. And the argument there in the last module was that we should be using all 5 depending on the circumstances we're in fact the people that we're leading, and that each of those, if they're used in the right place, at the right time, with the right people, will lead to a far more productive outcome. So I hope you had some fun with that, and today we're going to look at driving positive culture change, which is I know, a hot topic in local government around Queensland. All right, so let's get underway. First of all, I hope you had a chance to do your homework. I hope you had a chance in some of the meetings that you had, the people you had to interact with. I hope you had a chance to start varying your negotiation and conflict resolution style to suit the circumstances, and I'm always keen to hear of any wins that people had. If you just email me, I'd love to hear what's actually happened for you, which is fantastic. All right, so let's move on to the what we're going to be covering in this particular workshop. I want to talk about what culture is, because I think, you know, most of us have got a bit of an idea what culture is, but culture, what do we actually mean by culture, and how do we actually measure it? I want to talk a little bit about the concept of what I call and others call the ambidextrous organisation, and how I think this is a huge challenge for local government to become an ambidextrous organisation. I want to talk about the emotional stages of change, and there are 4. And if these 4 emotional stages are 100% predictable, which they are, your job and my job is to manage in anticipation of these 4 emotional stages. And if we do that effectively, we can be far better at managing change. We're going to look at 8 core values, and the 8 core values are the values that I believe that local government needs to work towards in order to have the culture that will be effective in the future. So I'll talk about those. And of course, this might all precipitate a thought in your head, at least, as to where do we start? So you've given us all this information. What might be the first step in what we do in order to get us moving towards culture change? So let's have a look at culture, generally speaking. This will come up on your screen very shortly. There it is. So this is my definition of culture, but of course, you can pick up any book on culture and you may get a different definition. I think they're all saying the same thing, but I've highlighted the key words here, and let's run through what the definition is. In my view, culture is the basic pattern, and it is a pattern. In other words, it's a repeating process of shared assumptions, values, and beliefs. So these are shared by management, they're shared by workforce, they're shared by middle management, even people outside the organisation, considered to be the correct way. They not necessarily are the correct way, but they're considered to be the correct way of thinking about and acting on problems and opportunities facing the organisation. So the basic pattern of shared assumptions, values and beliefs considered to be the correct way of thinking about and acting on problems and opportunities facing the organisation. So that's what my definition is. In a very simple way, it's the way we do things around here is essentially the simplest way that we can define culture. Now, if I went into your organisation, I may well have over the years, but if I walked in, the first thing that would hit me would be what we'd call the artefacts of organisational culture. So it would be the physical structures, the language that people were using, the rituals and ceremonies, the stories and legends. These are the overt. They're like the tip of the iceberg. They're the things that are above the waterline. They're the things that are very obvious, and I would notice those, and that would give me a clue as to the type of culture, the way people are addressed, the level of formality, how meetings are conducted. All of these things are visual cues as to how the culture of your organisation is. Now, I might say to you, and I've had the privilege of working in most of the local government authorities in Queensland, I might say to you that every council has its own culture, unique culture. And I find that really interesting, even though we're all in the same sort of industry, if I could put it that way. There is a unique culture to each. And you might recall in amalgamation, it was a very interesting time in the history of local government in Queensland, because a lot of organisations were bringing together, in some cases, 4 or 5 councils into the one organisation. And I remember doing work at that time with a number of councils, and my comment was that the word amalgamation was problematic, that it didn't imply what should happen. What should happen is that we're bringing together, in some cases, 4 or 5 organisations and creating a new culture of which there are 4 or 5 previous organisations, not merging together or amalgamating 5 or 6 cultures. That was not the right way to look at it. Some organisations, I believe, are still having some issues around amalgamation, perhaps because they haven't tackled the change as well as they probably could. Now, below the waterline, of course, we've got beliefs, values, and assumptions. Now, these are the hidden aspects of culture, if you like. So these are the things that people learn when they come and work with in your organisation. They're not the values necessarily on the wall, but they're the values that are generally governed by how things are done in your organisation. And they're far more subtle. But essentially there is the overt and the covert aspects of organisational culture. Now, before we sort of launch into some ways of looking at culture, it might actually be useful just to understand why we even have a culture. And you might say, well, isn't that just part of being human? Yes, it is. But I think, we need to understand what are the fundamentals of being human and why do we have a culture. So if I start at 12 o'clock here, it serves as a sense-making and control mechanism. In other words, if we all know, the way things are supposed to be done around here, what's important, what isn't, how we deal with crises, how we deal with management, how we deal with formality, all of those things make sense. And so it means that human beings want to know where they stand and they want to know what's right and wrong. Coming around clockwise now, it defines the boundaries. It defines the boundaries of appropriate behaviour. It defines the boundaries of inappropriate behaviour. It defines the boundaries of responsibilities. It defines the boundaries around hierarchy. All of these things provide us, again, with an opportunity to know where we stand. It also provides a sense of identity. So I belong to the council, I belong to this organisation, and this organisation has this sort of culture. So those things give us a sense of identity to belong to something. And it's fair to say that when you come into an organisation, the culture rubs off on you somewhat and you become imbibed in that culture. Sometimes it's done in a very it's not necessarily done in, it's done in a subconscious way, but you tend to absorb the rituals and the way things are done. It provides opportunities for people to realise that there's commitment beyond self-interest. So there's a bigger picture at stake here, and of course, local government's there to serve the community. We all know that, but I think culture actually creates a vibe around about the commitment to certain causes, what's important. And of course, all of that really means that there is stability. So culture is an agent of stability, and it allows people to work and function together in a stable sort of environment. So that's the reason that we have culture. So a lot of people say, well, we're trying to develop a culture in our workplace. You don't have to do that. There is a culture there already. There's a culture in every organisation. Whenever there's a group of people who congregate together, there is a culture because it's a human necessity based on these 5 needs. So the question really is not, do we have a culture? The question, of course, is, do we have a productive culture? And that's the question that I want to answer in our hour together this afternoon. Now, there are a number of ways that you can assess your culture. There are some fun ways, and there's some scientific ways, and there are things in between. This happens to be a fun way, and I would strongly urge you to consider this as a very interesting discussion piece at one of your next staff meetings. So you ask people basically 3 questions. You ask them, if you had to describe our council as a colour, what colour would it be and why? All right. 2, if you had to describe your workplace as an animal, what animal would it be and why? And 3, if you had to describe your council as a motor vehicle, what would it be and why? Now you'll find this is highly effective because what you're doing is you're getting people to start thinking of metaphors to explain the culture. So, for example, if you just said to people, can you describe the culture working here? People would give you a very strange look and probably not have a very good answer. But this forces people to think about a colour, an animal, and a vehicle. And this in itself is very insightful. I did this exercise with QR many years ago, many years ago, and the with the group of people that I was with, the colour was black, and I said why, and they said because we're not terribly exciting, and um, sometimes things go missing, and all sorts of things. I said, what would you describe as the animal? And they said, oh, an elephant. And they said slow to change, but also another reason was that, elephants never forget. We carry grudges. Okay. And finally, the vehicle was a Holden because my father worked here and my grandfather worked here, and it was kind of like a family tradition to work inside this organisation. So that's very, very insightful, very interesting, and obviously it wasn't a particularly positive depiction of the organisation of which they worked. But I did this also with IBM. This was when IBM was in its heyday, was at the top of its game, and the colour was gold because we're number one. The animal was a cheetah because we're fast changing and flexible and agile. And the motor vehicle was a Ferrari with all the bells and whistles because we're number one. So it had a very positive concept of themselves as a culture. So you might like to try that in your own team. And then what you could actually do is you could ask them where they are now. And then you could then say, all right, where would you like to be? What would be the colour, the animal and the vehicle you would like to be? Very good exercise. And obviously there'll be a gap between where you are and where you need to be. And you'll hear people around the room saying different animals, cars and vehicles. But what'll happen is that you'll get some very common themes running through. So that's a good exercise. Now you can do that with your team, or you could do this in a larger scale. You'll find that's a very insightful way of being able to get a handle on what people think is the culture of the workplace they're working in. So that's very useful. Perhaps a little bit more scientific is this way, and it'll come up on your screen very soon, hopefully. It's taking its time. There we go. You have here 10 what we call 10 key dimensions of organisational culture. Now, what these researchers have determined is that, you can look at culture through the lens of 10 different dimensions, and each of those dimensions will say something about the culture. And I've actually got people to actually score or rate their organisation on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being high, 1 being low, on each of these 10 dimensions, and then working out an average. It can be very, very interesting. And then, of course, you open up a discussion around some of the interesting anomalies around these 10 dimensions. So I'll just quickly run through them. I don't want to spend too much time, but you'll get these slides and you'll get a recording of this presentation as well this afternoon, hopefully. So how much individual initiative are people able to show? So if you think about your council, how much initiative can people show? I guess it depends on where they work and what we mean by initiative, but how much freedom and autonomy and independence do they have? Does the outdoor workforce have more freedom, autonomy and independence than the indoor workforce? How much risk tolerance is there? So if there's a high tolerance to risk, then anything goes. If there's a low tolerance to risk, then you'll find that there are systems upon systems and processes upon processes to mitigate mistakes and detect them early. And I would imagine, being relatively regulatory, most local governments would be fairly risk averse. What about the direction? Is it clear what the directions are and the performance expectations of people? All councils, of course, are required to produce a strategic direction document. So in that sense, they do have a clarity of direction. But what I find interesting is that by the time it goes down 3 or 4 levels in the organisation, it's not necessarily the case that what people are doing is directly or even indirectly related to the strategic plan. So that would be an interesting question to ask internally. Integration, the degree to which the units are encouraged to cooperate and integrate with each other. And as we know in local government, it's fairly siloed. And so cross-functional communication is a little bit dicey in a lot of organisations. So it's likely that the integration score may not be as high as it could be. Management contact, the degree to which managers provide clear communication and assistance and support, or whether they're hands-off or hands-on. I guess it depends on the size of the council, and we've got some people here in very large organisations and some very, very small. And I think that's got to have a lot to do with the management contact. Control is the degree of rules and regulations that are used to oversee employee behaviour. Is it heavily regulated? I think in local government it probably is to a certain degree. Identity, the degree to which the members identify with the organisation as a whole. It's probably in a small community, it's likely that your council will have a high degree of identity than if it was in perhaps a regional or city area. Reward systems, obviously we can't give out monetary rewards, but do we have reward systems in place? It's probably low in most local governments. The conflict tolerance, the degree to which employees are encouraged to air their conflicts and criticisms openly. Is there the opportunity to do that? And or is it that people will play nice? And I know that in some small country areas in Queensland, it's quite likely that people don't air their strong views because, you know, they've got to live with that person in terms of, you know, seeing them in the street and all the rest of it. Whereas in a large organisation in the city, that might be slightly different. And then you've got communication patterns, the degree to which organisational communication is restricted to formal lines of communication. In other words, you know, up and down the hierarchy. I think to a certain degree there's a fair bit of that in local government in Queensland. So there's perhaps a little bit more scientific way of being able to assess your own workplace. So, you know, you might want to consider that as an interesting way of looking at your culture. Now, the challenge I think that you have in local government is this challenge, and that is to become what we call ambidextrous organisation. Now, local government obviously is bound by an act, and as such, there are certain restrictions and rules and regulations that local government has to abide by, and rightly so, because the ratepayer is keeping local government afloat, and they would expect that certain regulatory requirements are being honoured internally. That's absolutely right. But at the same time, your challenge in local government is that you are being squeezed financially, that rates can't keep going up, and services can't keep expanding, so something has to give, and we have to become far more agile and innovative about how we do our business in local government. So therefore, as you can see the two lists on the left-hand side there, you've got the, what they call the exploitative or the current business. This is very much what local government's about. Formal, mechanistic, operational, efficiency, or, authority, top-down, profit centres, costs. All of these things are part of what local government is made up of, and I don't think there'd be a shortage of that in your organisation. So that's part of the fabric of local government. But on the right-hand side, this is perhaps more foreign to most of you. These are things that we are now requiring people to do in local government in order to find better, faster, easier, quicker, more cost-effective ways of doing business. So we want innovation, we want growth, we want organisations to be adaptable, we want to be a little more entrepreneurial than we perhaps would otherwise be. We want to be adaptive and take risks and flexible. So the reason I love the term ambidextrous, of course, is we can relate it to sport, and if you're a cricketer, and being ambidextrous means that you can either bat right hand or left hand, depending on your whim. So organisations being ambidextrous means that they can be regulatory on the one hand or very adaptive on the other. And your challenge is to create a culture that can actually sustain both sets of behaviours. And it is possible to do that. Mind you, it takes a little bit of work to do it. But you might want to think about that. And of course, in some parts of your business, it's more likely that you can be blue sky. In other parts, you've got to be doing it very much by the book. So there's a range of different possibilities there. Now, one of the things I do want to share with you, as I said earlier on, is the 4 emotional stages of change. And this is one of the most powerful models that I've come across in my 18 years of consulting, because it's so relevant and so real. And if we can just cast our eyes to the right there, you'll notice that you've got denial, resistance, exploration, and commitment. So you've basically got 4 different emotions, okay? And if you look at those emotions, every one of us in this broadcast goes through these 4 emotional stages whenever we're confronted by change. Sometimes we realise it, sometimes we don't. And the important thing to recognise here is that everybody that you lead actually goes through these different emotional stages of change as well. So the question is really, how can we frame our change around these 4 emotions? So over here on the left-hand side, you've got productivity, quite high, quite low. And down here we have time, short time, long time. So when you introduce a change in your organisation, the first emotional stage that people will actually enter into is what we call denial. Denial is where it's just business as usual, this is a passing fad, and before long we'll be just going back to our old ways. It can be enormously frustrating to you as a leader, because at that stage you're not in denial, but they are. And let me give you 2 examples of this, a positive example and a negative example of change, and to show you how these 4 emotional phases actually impact. Let's say, for example, that you're, maybe your son or your daughter has had an accident, car accident. I hope it hasn't happened to you, and I'm sorry if it has, but I just wanted to use this as an example. And you hear a knock at the door, so and you go to the door and you open the door and there are two police officers standing there at the doorway. And the police officers inform you that your son or your daughter's had an accident that evening. And of course, the first reaction you're going to have is, this can't be real, or I must be dreaming, or surely they've got the wrong house. You're actually in denial. You don't want to face the truth. And that's where you are right at that moment. Here's another example. Your mobile phone rings and you get on the phone and you answer your phone, and they say to you at the other end, "Hello, this is the Gold Lotto department," or whatever they'd say. "Congratulations, you've just won $5 million." Now, what's your first reaction going to be? Not Yahoo, believe it or not. It'll be, who is this? This must be some sort of a send up. It must be one of my friends having a go at me. You don't believe it initially because you're in denial. So either a positive or a negative change precipitates a emotion of denial. Now, it won't take too long, but what'll happen is that you'll start moving into resistance. And you've seen this, of course, in your own workplaces. This is where people are quite open and hostile about the change. So if I go back to the police analogy again, it won't be too long before those people will actually start accusing the police and other people. What were you guys doing on the other side of town, revenue raising, when you really should have been on the other side of town? Why didn't council fill in those potholes? And all sorts of excuses and pointing finger of blame. So that's what resistance is all about. Now, in the lotto example, of course, you're not going to be blaming anybody, but certainly you will initially be thinking to yourself, $5 million. Wow, that's a lot of money. That's going to change everything. I need to think through carefully this whole scenario, because this is literally life-changing. So you'll just balk a little bit there to think about how you might deal with it. So, of course, in local government, you see this one quite a lot, don't you? Resistance. But just realise it's a passing phase. Some people, of course, are professional resistors, and you give them free beer and they'll complain it's not cold. We've all got them in our organisations, but the good news is they're in the minority. And the good news is that the majority of people will be able to go through this change curve reasonably well if you handle it effectively. The next phase, of course, is exploration, where they start saying to themselves, well, this is real. I have no clue how to move forward, but I know it's real, and I need some skills and help and support in order to get me through this difficult phase. Productivity is low because skill level is low. It might be a new IT system or something along those lines, and it takes a while for people to understand how to use it. All right, so coming back to the police scenario, the knocks at the door, must have the wrong house. Then there's blame. Exploration is the door closes and Mr. and Mrs. Smith look at each other and say, look, we can just deal with things one step at a time. Let's get to the hospital, but we can just deal with one thing at a time. And that's all you can do. And of course, in the lotto example, who's this? Wow, this is life-changing. Exploration, of course, is making all the lists and thinking about how you might spend the money. And sooner or later, you get your productivity increases and you get to commitment. So you'll actually find some of the people, the greatest resistors of new ideas, will often be the greatest advocates for the change at the end. And in fact, they'll rail against any further change. At commitment, skill levels high, and we, looking back on the past, can make sense of the future. So if we go to the police analogy again, must have the wrong house, what were the local government doing, not filling in the potholes. Um, we just got to take it one step at a time. 20 years later, Mr. and Mrs. Smith are having a cup of tea. Mrs. Smith turns to Mr. Smith and says, "You know what? What happened 20 years ago was terrible. Remember when so-and-so got caught up in that accident? But one thing it did do is it brought us closer together." So there was some silver lining to the cloud. Of course, with Lotto, who's this? Oh, how am I going to deal with it? How am I going to spend the money? And then break open the champagne. And that happens fairly quickly because it's a very positive change. So it's a good model to think about, because in your own working areas, you will have lots of change where you can pinpoint those 4 emotional stages. And your job is to plan for it and accommodate it. Let me give you an example. Let's say that there is a change in your workplace and you have to implement it next Monday. So you decide to drag everybody into a meeting and you explain to them as clearly as you possibly can why the change is inevitable and what you need to do and all the rest of it. So you do a good thorough job in explaining it. And then you ask people at the end of your presentation for questions or comments. And there's dead silence. Now you interpret that as, wow, this is going to just fly. There'll be no opposition to this at all. That's a bad interpretation of the situation, because as people file out of the meeting, you overhear 2 people at the water cooler saying to the other person, what a stupid, idiotic change idea this is. And you walk up to them and you say, listen, you had your chance to say something, then you didn't. So what's wrong with you? Well, nothing's wrong with them. What's wrong is with the manager, because what's happened is since that meeting has broken up, those 2 have slipped into the emotional stage of resistance. They've had a think about it. They don't like what they hear, and they're thinking about all of the threats and implications of what it is that's going to get in the way. Now, instead of doing it the way you've done it, what I suggest to you is this way. You still have your meeting on Monday. You still explain to everybody what is intended. You still ask people if they want to ask any questions, but knowing full well it's highly unlikely. And then you say to the team just before they break is, I want to have another meeting on Friday. I want you to give a chance to have a think about what I've said today and how it might impact on your work. Undoubtedly, you'll have some questions that you want answers to, and I'm going to reconvene with you again on Friday. And on Friday's meeting, I want you to bring along all of your thoughts, ideas, and questions that you've got about the proposal. You see? So the week goes by, and you can be assured that by the time you get the team back together on Friday, that it'll be a different mood totally, because the general emotion has moved from denial to resistance over the course of a week. Now you might say, well, why should I have that meeting if people are going to be resistant? Well, they're going to be resistant anyway, so you might as well meet together. And your job at that second meeting is to bite your tongue until it bleeds and listen. Just listen. Just listen to what people have to say. Not convert, just listen. And by doing that reasonably effectively, you will neutralize to some degree the resistance that's in the room. Not totally, but to some degree. And you can definitely do a better job having everyone in the room doing it that way than people gossiping over the water cooler or in the lunchroom or sabotaging people in the field. So you see, tactically, you can do some good things. Now, your leadership around denial is to give people information. That's what you need to do. During resistance, you need to shut up and listen to what people have got to say. During exploration, you have got to support your people. You've got to be out and about. You've got to be away from your desk, and you've got to sponsor learning and development opportunities to assist people to overcome their low skill level with a new change. And then when you get to commitment, and you will, you need then to celebrate and recognise the efforts that people have made. So at this stage here, it is very important that you acknowledge where people have come from, thank them, and just remind them that very soon they'll be going down the roller coaster ride again, and there'll be something else that they've got to deal with. So you can see it's an excellent model for change, simple to remember, and works extremely well based on 4 emotional stages of change. So that's something you might like to consider. Now, this is a very busy slide, and it's probably, I'm not going to sort of go through it in great detail, but the one thing that I do want to point out to you, and of course you can read this later when you get your slides, is these values. I've listed in here 8 particular values that are critically important to local government now and in the future. And what you can do is use this as a framework to assist to mould the culture of your organisation to fit and accommodate these 8. Let's go through them. And also what you've got here is you've got management's expectation of employees, and here you've got employees' expectations of management. So there is a kind of like a mutual set of expectations around these values. But your job is to try to implement these values. What are they? Flexible deployment, meaning to be able to be more flexible than just being able to do one skill in one area. We need people to be able to be flexible and maneuverable. A lot of outdoor work crews do this particularly well. We need to actually incorporate this in the office environment too. Customer focus means that everything we say, think and do is in the interests of the end user, which of course is the customer. Easy to talk about, not so easy to do, but that's really important, obviously, for a organisation like local government. We need to be focused on performance, and what I mean by that is that performance is more than just doing the job. Okay, so performance focus is critically important in local government. We need to be more project-based. We need to break down these silos, and you might recall the session that I ran with you in module 4 around structuring workplaces. We need to create more cross-functional communication, and we need to base our work more on projects than silos. We need also to try to do whatever we can to inculcate human spirit and work. We need engaged people in the workplace, and we need to do everything we can to engage the majority of people. Really important. We want committed people. Loyal people is fine, but we want committed people. These are people that would say, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. We need, of course, to have an organisation that's based on learning and development, and we need to look at our whole learning and development. Do you have a mentoring program, for example? If not, why not? Is all of your learning technically focused, or is there problem-solving learning? Is there personal development learning? Are you using and exercising a full array of learning to get the best out of the people that you lead? And open information is all about sharing information and being transparent in terms of the information that you share. And that becomes really important too. When in doubt, I would suggest to you to share the information. If you're balking about doing it because you're not sure, then it's a surefire sign you should. And yes, it might end up on the front page of the local rag, could well do. But anything could end up on the front page of the local rag, as you know. So as they say, as we say in Brisbane, is it the courier mail test? Well, you know, you've just got to take a punt with these things. But if you don't open up the information channels, then people aren't going to have the necessary perspective that they need in order to act like managers, which is essentially what we want people to do. All right, so that model is your framework for the 8 values that are critically important in local government moving forward. So I'd like you to have a think about how closely aligned your organisation is to these 8 values, because from my experience, you'd probably be closely aligned in some, and in others you probably aren't very closely aligned. Now, people often say to me, all right, well, that's all very fine. I can see the value in those 8 values. I'm a busy person. I've got a council to look after. I've got my work to do. I've got people to lead. Where do I start? It's always a good question. Where do I start? If I wanted to change the culture of my workplace, where would I start? How would I start? What would I do first? And so forth. So let me share with you a process that I'll share with you, and some councils in Queensland have gone through this process quite effectively. The first thing that I would want to do is, when I say define a workplace sample, I'm going to send everybody in the organisation a survey. And what I'm actually after in terms of the results of this survey is that I'm actually after some benchmarks around those 8 values I just shared with you. And I want to know what people are thinking in relation to those 8 values. In other words, I want to know how far away we are from the ideals that I shared with you in the previous slide. The next question, or the next thing that I need to do, is to administer the survey, and I can administer that online, but for outdoor workers I can administer that as a paper and pencil version as well. So the whole idea now is to collect some data right across the organisation around how closely aligned we are to those values. Now, there's 80 statements in my questionnaire. Then once we've done that, the next step is to analyse the results. So we need to actually have a look at what people have actually said, and people have got an opportunity to give a number or to write a comment. And right across the board, it becomes very interesting what people have to say about their local government organisation. Then we form a project team, and this project team is a replica of the organisation. Normally consisting of 8 to 10 people, we would be looking at people who are a cross-section of all the various departments in the organisation. We would also look at a replica of the hierarchy, so we'd perhaps have more workers in there, some middle managers and some top manager, maybe one top manager. So the whole purpose of the project team is to provide another layer of engagement around the survey results. The next step is that we develop the team. So what happens is that we create a team, a team that's well developed, that can function and work together. And of course, some of these people in the project team have never worked with other people around the table before. So we need to give them some awareness of how they like to operate in teams, and really just build a team, basically. Then on the second day, it would be around developing some strategies that would be useful to improve the survey results so that they may better reflect the ideals I shared with you previously. So you can see it's very much a bottom-up approach, and I think this is the way to operate. So really what happens in that step 6 is that we get a scribe in the room who brings it all together and creates a report that determines, you know, the, 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 the climate of the organisation. The next step is to implement some strategies, and this could be done in a number of ways, but it could be recommended that you do this by sharing the report with the executive leadership team. Council may well want to be informed about the results of the survey as well, and that's quite reasonable. But of course, it's up to the executive to decide which of those strategies is worthwhile and which isn't, and look at some cost-effective ways of moving the organisation closer to the 8 values that I mentioned earlier on. And then, of course, you've got a process now in step 8 that you can use annually. There's one council where I do this annually, and sit down with the project team and work our way through it. So it's a good process, works really well, and you're involving lots of people and it takes the pressure off. So it's about measuring and doing something about the measures and doing it from a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach, which is a far better way of doing things. So, folks, if you've got any questions, now's the time to ask them. We've got about 5 minutes before we finish up. So I'd be keen, if you've got any questions, I'll try and answer those as well as I can. But that's one way. I mean, there are lots and lots of ways of being able to make an impact on the culture. But I often think the soundest way is to actually get a handle on what the culture looks like right now. And I've given you a couple of different ways of doing that. And then the next step, of course, is to try and implement some things that will help to steer or change the culture in the way that you want it. All right, so I think just while we're waiting for any questions, your homework, of course, each of these do have homework, is to use the templates here to plan your next change. So if you've got to implement some change next week, perhaps, on a lesser scale, you might use the 4 emotional stages of change. If you've got a really big organisational culture that you want to change, then perhaps you might use the corporate culture change cycle I shared with you in the previous slide. It just depends on what you're trying to do. But I do think at your level, it's really important that you become far better at managing change and do it well, because the reality is, as we all know, there's going to be more and more change occurring more and more frequently about more and more things. So local government is not immune from that. And while the community and your community is changing, they're expecting you to change as well. And at the end of the day, one of the big challenges, as we all know, for local government is attracting and retaining top talent. And what we need to do is to attract and retain the millennials in a career in local government, and we're not doing a particularly good job at that. We're an aging population, and once the baby boomers leave local government, it's going to leave a huge hole. So that's going to be problematic for organisations in the future, and we need to be able to deal with that as effectively as we can. All right, so folks, I don't know, no questions at this stage. Well, you've got my email address and you know how to get in contact with me, so I'm more than happy to accept questions and comments via email. More than happy for that to occur. Could I just thank you all for the opportunity of working with you in these 6 sessions. It's gone really quickly. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Some of the feedback I've had has been really encouraging. Thank you. Obviously, people have got a lot out of it, and I'd be more than happy to hear any other feedback that you have. If you want to send it to me via email, that would be brilliant. One other point is that we have another series starting on the 19th of January, and this series is more for middle managers and supervisors, and I'm inviting you to invite others inside your organisation to be part of the Lunch and Learn series starting in January on the 19th. If you would like to enrol people, register people in the program, I put there on that slide Patricia's details. Patricia can look after that for you in LGAQ and sort that out for you. So she's the contact at that point. I'm just the one who runs the process. But if you're interested, you can send me an email and I'll send your details on to her. But we'd like to get as many people involved as we possibly can for our next series on the 19th of January. So with those thoughts, folks, I think we might sign off. As I said, I've enjoyed working with you, and I wish you a very happy weekend and Christmas, and a really prosperous 2018. So I wish you well. Thank you for your involvement and all the very